The first sound Daniel heard was the crack. Not thunder, not footsteps, not even his own breathing. It was the sharp, splitting sound of wood giving up. For a moment, still half caught inside a dream, his mind tried to explain it away. An old beam settling, a branch brushing the side of the house, the sort of small noises that farmhouses made in the quiet hours before morning. But then came the heat, a fierce, unnatural warmth that pressed against his skin like an invisible hand. It crept along his arms, brushed his face, burned the air in his lungs. He opened his eyes. The ceiling above him glowed orange, thin lines of fire licking their way through tiny cracks he had never noticed before. Shadows danced violently along the walls, stretching and twisting like living things. Smoke pooled low, creeping like a dark tide across the floor and rising toward him. Fire. The words slammed into his mind with sudden clarity. He bolted upright in bed. "Lily!" His voice came out rough, swallowed almost instantly by the growing roar around him. Panic surged through him as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. The floorboards were already hot beneath his bare feet. Pain sparked, sharp and stinging, but he barely registered it. Lily! His 5-year-old daughter slept in the small room just across the narrow hallway. The room he had painted pale yellow for her the summer after Sarah passed. The same room where she pressed her tiny handprints against fresh paint, laughing without understanding how broken her father had been then. A scream of splintering wood rang through the house. The kitchen, his mind told him. He rushed into the hallway. Flames already crawled along the walls, devouring the family photographs that once hung there. The picture of Sarah at 16, Lily wrapped in a blanket as a newborn. A faded wedding photo where Daniel had been thin, hopeful, and deeply in love. The frames curled and blackened, the images inside twisting and disappearing. "Lily!" he shouted again, choking on smoke. Her door stood closed. A plume of dark gray seeped out from underneath it. Panic clawed at his throat as he crashed into it with his shoulder. The first blow barely budged it. The second sent a spiderweb of cracks across the wood. The third smashed it inward with a splintering snap. Firelight flooded the small room. Lily stood beside her bed, frozen in place. Her little hands clutched her stuffed rabbit, its once white fur now streaked with soot. Her wide eyes were rimmed red and filling with tears. "Daddy?" she whispered. That single word tore through him more painfully than the heat. "I'm here, baby," he rasped. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, ignoring the burning floor beneath him, and swept her into his arms. She wrapped herself around his neck as though she could disappear inside him. The ceiling above her bed crackled ominously. Daniel didn't even look up. He turned, racing back toward the hallway that had now transformed into a burning corridor. Flames climbed the wallpaper in greedy tongues. The air was so thick with smoke that he could barely see the far wall. The front of the house was gone to him. He could already hear the roof straining, the beams crying under the weight of heat. There was only one other way out. The back door. He ran. He ran through heat, through choking air, through the sound of his own heart beating so loud it drowned everything else out. At the end of the hallway, he lowered one shoulder and slammed into the back door with Lily held tightly against his chest. The wood burst open in a shower of splinters. A wave of frozen November air surged inside. And then they were outside. Daniel stumbled into the yard, collapsing to his knees in the dead grass. The cold hit his burning skin like a shock of needles. Lily sobbed into his shoulder, clinging as though the world might disappear entirely if she loosened her grip. He held her. He held her with everything he had left inside him. Behind them, the farmhouse roared like a wounded animal. Flames clawed up through the roof, bursting free in a storm of sparks that shot toward the starless sky. The fire lit the fields bright as day. What had been home now stood as a monument to destruction. Every memory he had built with Sarah, every careful repair, every night spent holding Lily after nightmares, every meal at the same worn table in the kitchen, all of it was being erased, piece by piece. A neighbor's voice broke through the chaos. "Daniel!" Lantern light flickered through the darkness as figures hurried across the fields. Hands reached for Lily, wrapping her in blankets, checking her arms and face for burns. Someone pressed another blanket around his shoulders. But Daniel didn't move. He barely heard them. He only watched as the roof finally collapsed in on itself with a thunderous crash that shook the ground beneath him. A cloud of sparks and ash raced upward, glowing, swirling, then fading into black. 10 years! Gone. A light snowfall of ash drifted down around the yard, gray snow settling on his hands, his hair, his clothes. A voice spoke beside him, calm and unmistakably steady. "You can't sit here all night." He slowly turned his head. She stood a little apart from the others, not rushing, not flustered. A dark coat fitted neatly around her tall frame. Her hair, once perhaps chestnut, now streaked with gray, pulled back in a tight knot. Her expression was firm, restrained but not cruel. He recognized her at once. Eleanor Hargrove. The woman at the edge of town. The one who never attended gatherings. The one who had not been seen to smile in more than a decade. The woman people whispered about because it made them feel better to turn loneliness into mystery. "I'm fine," he muttered automatically, his voice hollow. "You are not." Her gaze dropped briefly to Lily, still clinging to him. "And neither is she." He swallowed, looking down at his daughter. Her lashes clung together with tears, soot marking the curve of her cheek. "The church," someone began in the background. "We can set something up." "She will come with me," Eleanor said firmly, not raising her voice, but somehow cutting through the noise anyway. Several heads turned toward her in surprise. "You don't want her there tonight," she continued. "It's cold. It smells of smoke and old wood. She needs a clean bed. And warmth." Daniel looked up at her fully now. Her face gave nothing away. No sympathy, no pity, no kindness he could name. Just resolve. "You don't know me," he said. "I know loss," she answered. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in her eyes. And then it was gone. "I have 2 empty rooms," she went on, as if discussing the weather. "They will remain empty whether you come or not, so you may as well fill them." He hesitated. Pride warred with exhaustion. Habit argued against need. Then Lily shifted in his arms, her voice trembling. "Daddy, I'm cold." That was all the answer he needed. "All right," he said quietly. Eleanor gave a single nod and turned away without another word. "Follow me." Her house stood at the far end of the road, slightly elevated above the surrounding land. A white structure that seemed untouched by time. Even in the dark, even in tragedy, it appeared impossibly clean. Controlled. Preserved. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of dried lavender and polished wood. Each step echoed against floors that gleamed under the light of a single lamp. Daniel felt as though he had walked into a different world, one untouched by chaos. Eleanor led them up the narrow staircase. Every movement was precise, methodical, as if her life ran on rules written long ago and never broken. She opened a door at the end of the hall. A guest room, 2 small beds, carefully arranged, crisp white sheets, thick quilt folded at the foot, curtains pulled neatly over the window. A small basin of water rested on a table. Next to it, a cup. "You may wash her face," she said. "There is soap on the stand. Towels in the drawer." She stepped aside so Daniel could enter with Lily. "She can sleep here. You may take the other bed." "Mrs. Hargrove." "Eleanor," she corrected quietly, not meeting his eyes. "No one calls me Mrs. Hargrove, not anymore." He nodded, unsure of what to say. "Tea is on the stove downstairs. Drink it once she sleeps. You both need warmth inside you, not just around you." She moved toward the door. "Why?" he asked suddenly. She paused with her hand on the handle. "Why are you doing all of this?" he pressed. "You don't even know my name." "I don't need to," she replied. "I know the look in your eyes. I've seen it in the mirror myself." Then she left. The door closed softly behind her. Daniel stood in the quiet, Lily still trembling in his arms. For the first time since the fire, the world was silent again. He gently lowered her onto the bed, cleansed the soot from her face, wiped her small hands. She clutched the rabbit tighter as he pulled the blankets around her. "You're safe, sweetheart," he whispered. "You're safe." Her breathing slowly evened out as exhaustion claimed her. Daniel remained seated beside her for a long time, listening to the steady rhythm of her breath, to the faint ticking of a distant clock somewhere in the house. Outside, the distant glow of his burning home had finally faded from the sky. Only darkness remained, and inside this strange, silent house, something else lingered too, a presence he could not yet name. Not warmth, not cold, just a quiet beginning. Daniel did not remember falling asleep. He only knew that when he opened his eyes again, pale morning light filtered through unfamiliar curtains, thin and sheer. The first gentle touch of day entering the strange, quiet room. For a long moment, he didn't understand where he was. Then memory crashed back into him like a wave. Fire, smoke, heat, loss. He pushed himself upright, heart racing, eyes scanning the room in panic. Lily! She was still there, curled on her side in the narrow bed beside his own, her small hand wrapped tightly around the stuffed rabbit. Her cheeks were flushed with sleep, not heat. The soot had been washed away, leaving only the softness of childhood behind. Relief surged through him so violently his chest ached. He sat there breathing slowly, watching her rise and fall. The blanket had slipped just enough to reveal the edge of pale blue pajamas. He didn't recognize. Someone had changed her clothes. A quiet ripple of awareness moved through him. Eleanor. He glanced around the room again. Everything was in perfect order. His boots had been placed by the door. His coat hung neatly on a hook, the dampness of melted frost already gone. He stood, stepping onto the cool floor. No creaks, no groans, just silence. Downstairs, the faint clink of porcelain touched his ears, something being set down carefully. The soft snap of a flame under a kettle. He moved slowly down the staircase. The house in daylight was even more unsettling than it had been at night. Every surface gleamed. Every picture on the wall was aligned as though measured by an unseen hand. No dust, no clutter, no sign that a real person lived here. Despite the obvious fact that she did. In the kitchen, Eleanor stood at the counter, her back straight, sleeves rolled to the elbow as she poured hot water into a cup. Sunlight streamed through the window, touching the silver in her hair and outlining the fine lines around her face. For the first time, Daniel noticed how thin she was. Fragile almost, like someone carved out of quiet. "You're awake," she said, her voice even, without turning. "Yes." His voice sounded foreign to his own ears. "There is porridge on the table. She should eat before the shock settles into her bones." He glanced at the small bowl placed on the table, a tiny spoon resting beside it. "And you?" he asked. "I eat when I'm hungry," she replied. The kettle gave a soft whistle. She lifted it away from the heat automatically, as if her thoughts never strayed far from order. "You washed her," he said. "Yes." "Thank you." A long pause followed. "For what?" she asked quietly. "For treating her like she mattered." There was the slightest hesitation in her movement, barely even visible. "She does matter," Eleanor replied. "Children always do." He studied her face as she turned at last. The lines around her eyes were deeper up close. Not the lines of age, but the lines of things unsaid, of words swallowed, of years kept locked away. "She didn't wake?" he asked. "No. She slept until an hour after dawn. That usually means a child has dreamed something terrible. When the mind finally rests, the body refuses to move." Something twisted painfully inside him. "Yes," he murmured. "That's true." They stood there in silence a moment too long. "So," he said finally, "how long do you expect us to stay?" "As long as winter lasts," she answered immediately, too quickly. "Your land is ash. Nothing grows in ash, and a child should not be moved from place to place while she is still afraid of the dark." Hope, fear, and pride tumbled into one tangled knot inside his chest. "I can find work in town. I won't be useless." "I didn't suggest you would be," Eleanor replied calmly. "But I will not accept money from a man who has lost a house, a wife, and half his soul." He flinched at the raw accuracy of it. Her lips pressed tighter. "That was an unnecessary thing to say," she added. "It was a true one." Silence again. Then a small sound drifted from the stairs. "Daddy?" Lily appeared at the top, her hair tangled, eyes still cloudy with dreams. Daniel turned instantly. "Hey, sweetheart." He opened his arms. She hurried down the steps and raced into them, burying her face in his chest as though to prove again that he was real. "I had a bad dream," she murmured. "The walls were made of fire." "I know," he said, holding her close. "But you're safe now. Look around, baby. No fire here." She lifted her head slightly, glancing around the kitchen. Her eyes settled on Eleanor. The woman stood perfectly still. For an instant something passed over her face, a look so painfully soft it almost startled Daniel. a look she didn't seem to know she was making. "Are you an angel?" Lily asked in a small voice. Eleanor blinked. It was the first time he had seen her truly startled. "No," she replied very quietly. "I am not." "You saved us," Lily insisted. "I only gave you a bed and a bowl of porridge." "That's what angels do," Lily said matter-of-factly. A fragile, almost invisible smile touched Eleanor's lips. It disappeared a second later. "There is honey if you would like some," she said instead, moving toward the shelf. At the word honey, Lily's expression brightened. "Can I have it?" she asked, looking to her father. "Yes," he said softly. "You can have it." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she took the glass jar down. Sunlight poured through the golden liquid, making it glow. She set it on the table in front of Lily as though setting down something far more sacred than sugar and nectar. Lily dipped her spoon gently, tasting it. She sighed. "My mama used to give me honey when I had bad dreams." The air shifted in the room. Daniel looked up sharply. Eleanor had gone still. The tiniest muscle pulsed in her jaw. "You can have as much as you like," Eleanor said, voice barely above a whisper. Daniel watched her as Lily ate. The woman who had been carved from stone. Last night now watched the child as though something long sealed in her chest had been cracked open. Just a fraction. "Thank you, Miss Eleanor," Lily said proudly. "You may call me Eleanor," she replied. "No," Lily decided. "Call you Nell, that's nicer." A long, startled pause. "Nell?" Eleanor repeated. The word sat strangely on her tongue. And then, impossibly, she nodded. "If you wish," she said. Something unseen but powerful had shifted in that moment. By afternoon, the town had heard. Word traveled faster than fire ever could. By the time Daniel returned from checking the smoking remains of his farm, whispers followed him down the road like shadows. He heard them in pockets of conversation. "She took them in." "Her house?" "The cold one." "A man and a child under her roof?" "Shameful." "Or generous." "Perhaps she finally cracked." Daniel ignored them at first, until he saw the way Eleanor avoided the front windows, the way she pulled the curtains tighter, the way her back straightened further, as though bracing against judgment instead of weather. That night, Lily begged her to read. "I don't read stories," Eleanor answered. "But you know them," Lily insisted. "You look like someone who knows a lot of stories." Daniel expected her to say no, to retreat to silence. Instead, she disappeared down the hallway and returned with an old book in her hands. Its leather cover was worn thin, its corners bent. She sat a careful distance from Lily on the bed and opened it. At first her voice was quiet, controlled, but as the words flowed, something warmed within it, like embers catching air. Daniel stood in the doorway listening, heart stilled by the sound. Her voice was steady, gentle, almost loving. Lily's eyes grew heavy. Her little fingers curled into the blanket. By the time Eleanor closed the book, the child was asleep against her arm. Daniel watched in silence. Eleanor very slowly, very carefully slid out from beneath Lily's weight. She rose and moved into the hallway. When she saw him standing there, she flinched slightly. "She sleeps deeply," Eleanor murmured. "Yes. They remind me of someone I used to know," she added, and then stopped speaking as if she had said too much. "Who?" Daniel asked quietly. She did not answer. Instead, she turned away, walking down the corridor. But she left the door to Lily's room slightly open, and that meant more than words ever could. Later that night, when the house had slipped once more into silence, Daniel found something he had not noticed before. At the end of the hallway, half hidden behind a cracked door, lay a room untouched by time. A child's room, a small wooden bed, a faded quilt stitched with tiny flowers, a miniature rocking horse covered in dust, footprints on the floor, long gone. A breath caught in Eleanor's chest as she spoke from behind him. "I should have locked that." He turned, startled. Her gaze rested on the past as if it were still alive. "She was 5, she said quietly, "when the fever took her." His heart twisted. She loved that horse. Her laughter used to echo down these halls. "And now?" he whispered. "Now there is only quiet." He met her eyes gently. "Until tonight." For the first time since he had met her, Eleanor did not look away. And for the first time, she did not try to hide the emptiness behind her gaze. The wall around her heart had cracked. and something long buried had begun to breathe again. The town did not approve of quiet changes. It noticed them too quickly, studied them the way some people study a bruise on another person's skin, with curiosity, suspicion, and a kind of hidden pleasure that comes from knowing someone else has been marked. Daniel felt it the first time he walked into the general store 2 days later. The bell above the door chimed, the same simple sound it had made for years, but the conversations inside stopped too abruptly. Heads turned a little too slowly. Eyes tracked him as he moved between the narrow aisles of sugar, flour, and tools. He could almost hear their thoughts before the whispers even began. He's living in her house, with the girl, under Eleanor Hargrove's roof. That cold woman. That strange woman. He kept his eyes forward, placing items quietly into the basket, refusing to acknowledge the invisible fingers pointing at his back. When he reached the counter, Mr. Hadley avoided his gaze as he rang up the supplies. "You settling in all right?" the man asked, though his voice held none of the warmth it used to. "We're safe," Daniel answered simply. "That's all that matters." A woman down the counter leaned toward another, whispering behind a raised hand. It wasn't quiet. It was meant to be heard. "She's buying herself a family," she murmured. "That one." After all these years alone, Daniel's hand tightened around the bag until the paper creased. He didn't respond, didn't give them the satisfaction of anger. But when he left the store, his chest felt heavy, and for reasons he didn't yet fully understand. The weight was not for himself. It was for Eleanor. He found her in the back garden when he returned, kneeling in the winter soil, carefully clearing dead leaves from around stubborn sprigs of herbs that refused to die. "You shouldn't be working the ground in weather like this," he said. She didn't look up. "The earth doesn't mind the cold. Only people do." "I heard them today," he confessed. Her fingers stilled for just a moment. "Heard who?" "Them, in town. Their talk." Silence stretched between them, thin and cold. "You always will," she replied finally. "People fear what they don't understand, and they understand joy far less than they understand grief." "You shouldn't be the one they whisper about," he said. A faint breath escaped her lips, a sound halfway between a laugh and something sadder. "For 12 years, Daniel, they have said worse than this about me. They said I was cursed, that my home was haunted. Some even said I killed my own family with coldness." She looked up at him then. "You cannot defend someone who stopped defending herself a long time ago." "Well, what if she wants to start again?" he asked gently. Her eyes stayed on his a second too long, as if searching his face for the truth behind the question. Then she stood and turned back to the garden. "She would be foolish," she murmured, "to believe that the world might finally be kind to her." Winter tightened its grip. Snow dusted the ground. Wind whispered through bare branches. And inside the quiet house, something complicated was growing without a name. In the evenings, Lily started pressing against Eleanor's side instead of sitting near Daniel. She followed her through the kitchen, asked her questions, wanted to know where each plate belonged, what each dried plant was for, why the windows were washed so often. And Eleanor answered, softly, carefully, like someone relearning how to speak a forgotten language. "This is rosemary," she said one evening, holding up a small bundle of dry leaves. "It helps you remember things." "What kind of things?" Lily asked. "Important ones," she replied. Daniel watched from the doorway as Lily nodded solemnly, as if remembering was a sacred duty. "Can it make you remember happy things?" she continued. Eleanor hesitated. "Yes," she finally said, "if you let it." And for a second she looked as though she were trying to believe her own words. That Saturday the storm came. Not the quiet kind that dusted the rooftops and whispered away by morning. This one howled. It rattled the shutters, screamed down chimneys, clawed at the doors like something alive and furious. The house dimmed, lit only by a few lamps and the strained glow of the hearth. Lily curled into Daniel's side on the couch, her body warm, her breath slow and steady. She'd long since lost her constant fear of fire, but the sound of angry wind still reminded her of that first horrible night. Eleanor sat in the chair near the window, staring at the glass as if watching the storm. Communicate something important, only to her. "You're not afraid of thunder?" Daniel asked quietly. "No," she replied. "Thunder does not hurt what is already broken." The words sat heavy in the air, "Eleanor," he said. She did not respond. Her fingers were twisting the edge of her skirt so tightly the fabric had begun to wrinkle beneath them. He rose, crossing the room slowly, kneeling beside her chair. "You don't have to stay strong all the time," he said softly. "Not in this house." For a long moment she said nothing. Then suddenly, as if a dam inside her had shattered, the words poured out. "I had 2 children once," she began, her voice raw, unfiltered. "A boy and a girl. Margaret and Thomas, twins, full of light, noise, life." Daniel held his breath as she spoke. "The fever came in the night the way fire came to you. Quiet at first, unnoticed, then unstoppable. One coughed, one burned. I held them both in my arms and begged God to take me instead." Her hands trembled now violently, but he didn't. The storm outside slammed against the house. He took them instead, both of them, less than 2 days apart. And when their bodies were lowered into the ground, something inside me followed them. She turned to look at Daniel, eyes brimming, but still no tears fell. I buried my heart next to their little coffins. I folded it up, locked it away. If I did not feel, then nothing could ever be taken from me again. A long, painful pause. "And then you brought a living, breathing child into these rooms," she whispered. "And every step she takes is like a knock upon that locked door." Silence filled the space. The only sound now was the storm and the slow crackle of the fire. "I am terrified of loving her," Eleanor confessed, "because to love her is to create another grave in advance." Daniel's voice was barely above a breath. "She already loves you." Her face collapsed at that sentence. A single tear finally slipped free. Then another, and another. Daniel reached out, hesitant, then placed his hand over her clenched fingers. "Losing people is part of living," he said. "But so is finding them." Her breath stuttered. "You are not replacing your children by loving mine," he continued. "You are honoring them by choosing life again." The silence softened. The storm lost its violence, and for the first time in 12 years, Eleanor allowed herself to lean into another human being as she cried. Not for loss, but for the possibility of something new. Daniel did not move. He simply held her there in the quiet between thunder. That night, Lily crept down the hallway again. Daniel watched her from the shadows, as she padded carefully into the old nursery at the end of the hall. She stared at the dusty toys, the tiny bed, the rocking horse. Then she knelt on the floor and spoke in a whisper. "Hi," she said. "I'm Lily. I think I live here now." A small pause. "I'm going to take care of Miss Elea Nell, because she's sad sometimes, and she doesn't know how to be not sad." She climbed onto the old bed and tucked the faded quilt around herself. "I think she's my family now," she added. Daniel quietly stepped back, tears stinging his eyes, because at that moment he realized something he had been refusing to name. This wasn't a guest room anymore. This wasn't a temporary shelter. This was becoming a home. And somehow, without anyone planning it, they were becoming a family. Spring did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, like a shy child stepping into a room no one had entered for a very long time. The snow softened, then disappeared. The ground, once frozen solid, grew damp and dark. Tiny green shoots began to rise from the earth, stubborn and brave, as if they were proving that winter could not win forever. Daniel walked the edge of his land each morning, where his farmhouse had once stood. The blackened foundation still scarred the ground, a hard outline of everything he had lost. For weeks after the fire, he had avoided this place. It had felt like standing over an open wound. But now, he came there every day. He didn't come to mourn anymore. He came to remember. He could still see where the kitchen had been, where Sarah had laughed while kneading dough, where Lily had sat on the table, legs swinging, telling him stories that made no sense but meant everything. The sight of it no longer crushed his chest. It simply ached, and even that ache was growing softer. Behind him, he heard small footsteps crunching through damp grass. "Daddy?" He turned to see Lily running toward him, her cheeks pink from the morning air. Behind her, Eleanor walked more slowly, her hands wrapped in a shawl despite the warming sun. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Lily said seriously, as if she were the parent now. He knelt and opened his arms. She collided into them, hugging him fiercely. "I wasn't alone," he said quietly, looking up at Eleanor. I was thinking. Thinking what? She asked carefully. I don't want to rebuild it, he answered. Her brow furrowed slightly. You don't want a house of your own again? I don't want another house filled with ghosts, he said. I don't want to start fresh in a place that only reminds me what's gone. Lily looked between them confused. Then where will we live? Daniel looked up at Eleanor now. With her, he answered. If she'll have us. The world seemed to stop moving for a heartbeat. The air hung still. Eleanor's fingers tightened in her shawl. For a long moment she said nothing. I never planned to open that house again to anyone, she whispered. It was meant to stay frozen, untouched, a place of memory, not of life. And now? He asked. And now, she said softly, a child has walked through its halls and filled its empty rooms with laughter. Tears pooled in her eyes, but she did not wipe them away this time. It doesn't belong to ghosts anymore, she continued. It belongs to you, to her, to us. Daniel stood and walked toward her, slowly, carefully, as if he might frighten the moment away. I don't want Lily to grow up thinking home is something that can be burned down overnight, he said. I want her to grow up knowing home is wherever love waits for her at the door. He took her hand, and that love is here. For once Eleanor did not pull away. Instead she turned her hand in his and held it firmly, as if she had been doing so her whole life. Yes, she answered. Then this is where you will stay. Lily clapped her hands joyfully. We're a real family now, she declared. Daniel and Eleanor exchanged a small, fragile smile. But it was real. The town did not change overnight, but it began to grow quieter about them. People noticed the little things. They saw Eleanor walking, Lily to the schoolhouse when lessons resumed in early spring. They saw Daniel fixing the broken fence along her orchard, his hands steady, familiar with honest labor. They saw laughter drifting from the once silent porch, and somehow, the whispers began to lose their sting. At the market, Eleanor was offered fresh apples without comment. At the church steps, a woman she had not spoken to in a decade nodded at her with something like respect. No one apologized, but kindness slowly replaced judgment, and that was enough. By autumn, the old skeleton of Daniel's farmhouse had been transformed, not into a new home, but into something that testified to both loss and growth. Where walls had once stood, now beams supported a tall, sturdy barn. Fresh red paint shone under the sun. Golden hay filled its belly. Why a barn? Lily asked as they stood before it, hands on her hips. Because, he said, even what burns can rise again into something useful. She nodded as though this was the deepest wisdom she had ever heard. You're very smart, Daddy. I learned from pain, he said. Eleanor squeezed his arm gently. And from love, she added. The wedding happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. No long veil, no grand celebration, no town-wide announcement, just the warm parlor of a once lonely house filled with gentle light. Lily wore a simple white dress Eleanor had sewn herself, tiny stitches made in late-night silence now transformed into something sacred. Daniel stood beside her. Eleanor stood before them in a soft green dress that made her look years younger, as if life itself had touched her again. Pastor Green spoke few words. Words were not necessary. When Daniel took Eleanor's hands, she looked up at him and whispered something that only he heard. I am not afraid of love anymore. Neither am I, he replied. Lily beamed. You're my new mama now, she said proudly, wrapping her arms around Eleanor's waist. And this time Eleanor did not freeze. She knelt and held the child with everything she had stored inside, her for 12 long years. I would be honored to be your mother, she whispered. Thanksgiving came quietly. 1 year after fire had swallowed Daniel's world whole. This time the kitchen glowed with warmth instead of flames. The table was larger. The windows stood open to crisp autumn air. The smell of roasting turkey and sweet bread filled every corner of the house.